Good evening and welcome to The Breakdown. I am Tara Setmayer. This is the Rick Wilson, and I am happy to be
Sorry, I
back
was Venmoing somebody.
Oh God, Rick! It's starting already. I was gone for a couple days, and Rick had no adult supervision, and he's been off and running. But I am grateful that there was no chest hair as originally promised. So that is a win for two shows. But Rick,
Yeah.
oh Lord, here we go. Rick Wilson After Dark. But I am happy to be back. We had a great time out in the Outer Banks for a couple days, and I posted some pictures to social media to show folks. We had never been there before, Rick. You know, I'm from Jersey, so I'm used to the Jersey Shore. It's my happy place, and the Outer Banks are a very different vibe. It was very different, but it was cool because the northern Outer Banks are different than the middle Outer Banks, and we got a little taste of everything. And the 4x4 beach and the wild horses in Kerala. We never saw them, but they're there. It was really cool.
There.
But I'm glad to be back, and my husband's very happy. We had a great birthday with our family.
I'm so glad.
Thank you. It was a much needed reprieve. I'm recharged. I got a little color. I'm good to go.
I love that.
Thank you. So, lots going on. Since I left a week ago. Jeez. But we have a great guest for tonight's show. We have historian and a prolific author, Professor Julian Zelizer, to talk to us about the Republican Party, some of the origins of some of the quackery that's going on now. And he wrote this really great book called Burning Down the House, one of 19. And we're going to talk to him a little bit about the state of the GOP and whether it's possible for them to survive this period of absolute lunacy that we see every single day. So stay tuned for him. We also have a debuted ad tonight, a special exclusive that will debut a little later in the show. Stay tuned for that. We're not going to tell you what it is just yet, but we think that you will appreciate it. So stay tuned for the newest Lincoln Project exclusive ad coming out in a little bit. Rick is smiling because he's very proud of this one because I'm sure you can imagine the subject matter. Do not give it away, Wilson.
I won't. We're not talking about the Law of the Sea Treaty, though, people.
No, we're not. Which was actually a thing a couple of years ago when I was a staffer on Capitol Hill. That was actually a big thing back in the early 2010s, the Law of the Sea thing. Yes, back when policy was actually being debated. But as always, we want to hear from you. So make sure you go ahead and tweet us at #AskTheBreakdown. There it is, #AskTheBreakdown. You want to ask a question of me or Rick or Julian later on in the show. And of course, we always want to hear from you from the voicemail. We're still doing it, old school. There is the number. Give us a call. We do listen to your voicemail message.
Hey, Tara and Rick. My name is Carla. I don't think my husband and I could have made it through the last year without you guys. We had taken to drinking and everything, and we watched you every time you came on. We've contributed, and we just think you guys are awesome. And you're still helping us. So thank you.
I got to tell you, Rick, those messages are they're encouraging. I mean, I hope that they didn't drink excessively, even though I get it, because we used to drink on the show every Friday night because that helped us get through it. But in moderation, folks, in moderation. But thank you, Carla, for supporting us. And we were happy to do it and glad that the result was what we all worked really hard for, which is President Joe Biden. So, Rick, before we get into it, today is Holocaust Remembrance Day. And I don't think that over the last few years, with a certain ex-president who was in the Oval Office, really gave enough attention to Holocaust Remembrance Day. I can remember they put out some generic statement that didn't even mention the Jewish people. It was like some generic weird thing. And it was just such an affront to the suffering and the absolute horrors of the Holocaust. And considering that a lot of the fringe right, they're Holocaust deniers, and that was something that, was coming out from the fringes during the Trump administration. They kind of gave them license to be a little bit more mainstreamed, which is absolutely disgusting. But those days are behind us for the most part. And here at the Lincoln Project and on LPTV, we want to properly acknowledge Holocaust Remembrance Day and the people who were murdered by those terrible bigots and evildoers, and also for the people who rose up and fought back. And I think that given the fight that we're in now, it just really puts it in perspective. So for all of those who stand up and fight for what's right, remember the people who came before you and what they stood up against. And if they could do it, we can do it. So we thank everyone who continues to support us. And for you folks out there, stand up for what you know is right, because we don't ever want to see something like what happened in the 1930s and 40s in Germany ever happening again and in Europe. Hey, Rick, have you ever been to the Holocaust Memorial in Israel, in Jerusalem?
I have not, actually. I have not been to Yad Vashem. I need to go there someday. So
it is.
I understand it's amazing.
It is one of the most emotionally intense experiences when you see the arc of what happened, and they really spare no details, and you see the horrors of humanity right there in front of you. I had the honor and humbling privilege of visiting in December of 2018, and it was speechless. Like, talking about it now, I still get goosebumps, because my family, my grandparents, my great-grandparents actually came over through Ellis Island from Germany. And my grandfather was the youngest. Setmayer is a German name. And my grandfather was the youngest. He was actually born here. But his older brothers and sisters, they were born in Germany. And the family lore is that one of the reasons why they left Germany was because the Nazis were recruiting my grandfather's older brother. At the time, he was only, I think, 10. His name was Max. And they were like, yeah, we're not doing this, and decided to come to America in the 1920s. So as they were building up the brown shirts in the youth army, the Nazis, my grandfather's brother was actually recruited. And knowing that family history and then standing there in the Holocaust Museum in Israel was overwhelming. It was overwhelming. So I encourage folks, if they have the opportunity, if you can't go to Israel, at least visit the Holocaust Memorial in DC. It's life-changing. So I just wanted to get that out. What else did I miss, Rick? Did I miss anything else?
There's a minor scandal among the rising stars of the MAGA world. We've got a pretty endless supply of the deliciousness right now on our friend Matt Gaetz. Tonight I was interested in something. There were people a few days ago that were saying, "Oh, this is all fake news. It's all going to go away. You're all going to owe Matt a big apology." And tonight, the Daily Beast is reporting, and the New York Times is following it up, apparently, that the Venmo records of Matt Gaetz and Joel Greenberg indicate that they were paying for the company of young women. We don't know if these are 18 or above, but what we do know is they were paying for them on Venmo and Cash App with memo lines like tuition and school. And this is now, Matt Gaetz has said, truthfully, I have never paid for sex, but he paid his friend to pay them to pay the girls. So this thing is falling apart quickly. It is a scandal of Floridian proportions, which is to say, every day it basically becomes exponentially more scandalous and crazy. So another one of his staffers quit tonight. But one of the things it really teaches us is that the idea that there's this magical MAGA way to handle media, where you just bull through it, and you just try to tweet your way past it, and you say fake news louder and louder every time, it really doesn't exist. Donald Trump played that game for a few years, but he was sui generis in a lot of ways. Guys like Matt Gaetz, they are going to fall victim to the everything Trump touches dies curse. And that idea that he was going to bullshit his way past this when his buddy has now flipped for the feds, it's delicious. We had I know we collected a piece of video today on that I just cannot wait to play again, because I've played it a few times today.
Yes, I'm sure you have. And just for a disclaimer, these are all allegations. Allegedly, this is what Matt Gaetz was involved in. And it doesn't look good for him, as you said, because his buddy, Joel Greenberg, right? He was the tax collector in Seminole County. He's caught up in a federal case of all kinds of things. including the trafficking allegation as well. And that was Matt Gaetz' roll dog. And so he had a hearing today, and his lawyer was rather evasive when he was actually asked the question, did his client ever help Matt Gaetz get underage girls for sex? And he paused and said, oh, and he made like all kinds of comments about the reporter. And, then he said, I'm not going to comment on that. I think we have a clip of it. Let's play it.
Does Matt Gaetz have anything to worry about?
Does Matt Gaetz, that is such a... when
it comes to what happened today in court.
Does he have anything to worry about? And you're asking me to get into the mind of Matt Gaetz, right? And
well, from your mind.
From my mind.
Based on what your client knows.
Based on what my client knows. Okay.
And the fact that he's...
See, I thought if I kept on talking, I would avoid these questions and not to say, I'm sure Matt Gaetz is not feeling very comfortable today. All right.
Yeah, there were lots of juicy tidbits in that press conference, and if that guy's my lawyer, I'm not feeling too confident about things. Or if that guy's my friend's lawyer who's got a lot of stuff to tell, to flip on me on, I'm not having a good night's sleep tonight.
I was told that the price tag for a plea deal for Greenberg, I asked what the price tag was, and I was told by a very good source today, the price tag was every goddamn thing he knows, and a complete rollover. So I think it's going to be a very bad. It's going to be a very bad period between now and May 15th, when the plea deal will be finalized for Matt, because nothing's going to improve for him in this window. Nothing's going to get any better.
Yeah.
I'd like to point out two
we're a
things.
week in. We're a week in, right, Rick? And this,
right.
and every day, something gets worse. The reporting.
And this guy is still on the Judiciary Committee in the House of Representatives,
which is absurd.
And he is, and there is no world in which, if this was a Democrat in this position, that Kevin McCarthy wouldn't be out setting his hair on fire every second of the day to claim that they were the party of pedos and and it would never ever stop. But as it is,
right.
Matt will be welcome this weekend in beautiful South Florida to speak at a conference, right?
A women's conference for fuck's sake. I mean, it's called the Women for America First event at the Trump Doral, because Doral is not doing well, so they need the business. And I mean, I don't know how that's going to go. He's still on the schedule as of right now, but I'll be curious to see if he actually still goes through with it. I mean, if his speech is anything like that bizarre Tucker Carlson interview last week, or the statements that his office has been putting out, I can't imagine that that's going to go well for him. But who knows? The saga continues with this. And staying in Florida, this weekend, the RNC's quarterly meeting, I think, is down there, and they're staying at the Four Seasons, and that's the hotel. They're not having the meetings at the landscaping company in Philadelphia.
Irony never stops.
Oh my God. Who came up with that? Did they not think that people weren't going to crack jokes about it? I don't know. But anyway, they are having a cocktail event at Mar-a-Lago. So that means that their favorite president, their cult leader, will be there to speak. And this is consistent with this story that came out last week about the Trump campaign and their deceptive fundraising tactics, where they basically tricked their donors into monthly donations, repeated donations. And because they didn't put in the fine print that the default was to continue donating, so people thought they were just donating once. And now the NRCC is doing the same thing. But they're actually threatening people. It was in the Post today, the Washington Post, that the National Republican Congressional Committee, that here it is right here. It says, we need your help to draft Trump for president. Check this box if you want Trump to run again. Uncheck this box if you do not stand with Trump. Make this a monthly recurring donation. But then on the bottom, this is the part that is insane. We need to know we haven't lost you to the radical left. If you uncheck this box, we will have to tell Trump you're a defector and sided with the Democrats. Check this box and we can win back the House and get Trump to run in 2024. What the hell? I mean, defectors. We're going to tell Trump.
Right.
Like, if this isn't authoritarianism 101, I don't know what the hell is.
This is an example of a group of people who understand that there are no consequences for their shitty behavior now. They're going to milk this thing dry. They're going to use every scare tactic in the book. It is classic authoritarianism, fear mongering and threats. It's classic authoritarianism to go out there and to tell people you're either with the party or you're not. And if you're not with the party, who knows how long your house will stay up? Nice house there. It might burn down if you're not in the party. Right. Yeah, it is. And this is one of these loyalty checks, and they've monetized the fear mongering and the threat and the sort of emotional and political extortion aspects of authoritarianism in a way that when you see it on a screen, you're going to pay for the privilege of being threatened by these people. And the idea that Donald Trump is going to be told you're a defector. There are people on that list, though, who said, I don't want to be called a defector by the president. And they clicked that, and they checked that box. And there are people that are going to, put out the last part of their Social Security check because they're afraid that Donald Trump will think they've defected to the radical left.
Yeah.
It's an astounding,
it's unethical.
It's unethical, but it's also like, it's insulting. It is so patronizing and so insulting. But
I remember back in the day when the NRCC used to be respectable, the RNC, the NRCC, the NRSC, the Senate wing. It was the crazies, the fringe organizations that would put out these, nothing at this level, but the more, the more inflammatory language was usually like the super PACs. Not from the mainstream, arms of the party that were trying to get people elected to Congress. Like, this is off the deep end stuff, man.
As our buddy Steve Schmidt says, they're not going to get less crazy. They're not going to get less QAnon. They're not going to get less lunatic. They're going to get more so because, folks, remember, if you're giving your money to the NRCC, even if you're a Republican, you're giving your money also to Marjorie Taylor Greene and Lauren Boebert. And Paul Gosar and Boebert and Louis Gohmert and all the wackadoodles. This money all goes into one pot and comes back out. However, the head of the NRCC decides to spend it, you get no control over it. So you can't say, "I want you to give my $200 to Adam Kinzinger." It's going to go to the crazies. The crazies are going to eat first at the table. And
the crazy thing about this is that Trump is competing with the party fundraising arms. Remember, he sent them a cease and desist letter to stop using his name. So, the insanity of this, the fealty that continues despite how abused they are. Trump is an abuser, and they still keep coming back, pleading and begging for him to love them. And it's never going to happen. And they debase themselves in the process.
Sure. But I promise you, Tara, the fact that his name is appearing and he's not squawking about it means they've given him a cut.
That's right.
He's got a piece of the big coming out of this deal, and he's going to make money off of it. And he doesn't care what they do as long as he's making his cut, which is probably some absurd number. He'll keep it up.
And as long as they patronize his properties, which are failing miserably financially, there's that too. Speaking of failing miserably. I don't watch Fox News because I just can't anymore. It is just beyond unwatchable. However,
it's agonizing to watch.
It really is. They should not be called a news channel. But they have this new late night comedy show now called Gutfeld with exclamation points. Kind of like Jeb, and it's Gutfeld now. Yeah. As bad as this freaking show is, he probably was thinking that. I don't know, because it is awful. Take a look at this. It's terrible.
Over at MSNBC, let's see what Brian Williams is up to right now.
Good evening, I'm Brian Williams, and I am on Mars.
Meanwhile, what's on CNN?
You, sir, are racist. Racist.
I'm as giddy as Kamala Harris explaining kids in cages, or Woody Allen hearing about kids in cages. Look what's happening to Delta. They're more scared of tweets than of birds flying into their engines.
I can't believe that I stayed up 3 hours past my bedtime to watch this.
Yes.
You might consider moving this show back to 3 a.m. and where you belong, and maybe, post it on YouTube or something.
Maybe the bear does have a point there.
The bear is a racist.
He is a racist.
We can't get those 2 minutes back from our lives. Imagine the people who are watching this god-awful. Greg Gutfeld has never been funny, Rick. Why does this guy still get his own shows on Fox? There are actual funny people out there. He's not one of them and never has been.
I have to imagine he works cheap. I mean, I saw a few other clips from this, and look, there's a difference between being a comedian and between being funny. And a comedian is a skill. It's a skill. I'm funny, but I'm not a comedian. Greg Gutfeld is not funny, and he's not a comedian. That was the most agonizing laugh track stuff I've ever seen. And it's awful. Like, what is this? The MAGA comedy hour? It was like dinner theater. It was god awful. Ugh.
And all of his shows have been like that. He's been on Fox for years. Remember when he had Red Eye and like that show that Dana Perino was talking about? That used to come on at like 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. And a bunch of people actually got their starts on that show, like S.C. Cupp and some others were discovered after being on that show. But he was awful then. And then awful on the 5. I just don't, I don't get it. But he is just part of this whole cadre, this cottage industry of C-listers that continue to make money in this right-wing conservative echo chamber that are talentless. And I guess it works for them. They keep giving the guy shows. I don't know. I've never seen so many people fail up like these people.
The only thing I've discovered that's worse than a Trump comedian is a Trump rapper, which is a whole separate area of bad that must not be contemplated, or you will lose your mind.
Yes, and it exists, folks. It does exist. Rick is not making this up.
It really does.
It exists. It's some very weird stuff. Well, before we jump into our guest tonight, we promised that we would debut a new ad, and I think that. This encompasses a lot of what we've been talking about, just the awfulness of Republicans and Matt Gaetz and this whole culture that has been created around the cult of personality that Donald Trump is and what he's created in politics since he stepped on the scene. And Rick, we're going to run it, and then you can talk about it after.
Let's do it.
Let's take a look. It's called...
The Republican Party is in shambles. Defeated, shamed, reviled. For 4 years, they towed the party line, and as they did, new stars emerged. Stars like Matt Gaetz, slick and sycophantic. Gaetz was a man after Trump's own heart. Like Trump, he bought influence and power through his family's wealth, spilled his ego on everyone he met, and now he's under investigation on allegations of sex trafficking and a sexual relationship with an underage girl. Gaetz won't lose the support of his mentor over this, and the Republican Party still does what Donald Trump says. They got into bed with a madman, and they still believe they can outlast the stain of Trump's legacy. But some things can't be washed away. Some things are just too dirty.
No holds barred on that one, Rick. Talk about it.
Here's the thing. Matt Gaetz was a representative of not the 1st District of Florida, but of the Donald Trump movement, of the MAGA movement. He wasn't in Congress to legislate. He wasn't in Congress to represent his district. He didn't care about any of that. He was a guy who spent as much time as he could on Fox News. He was a guy who spent as much time as he could preening before the cameras to show he was the uber, ultra, outlier megastar of Donald Trump's loyal defense team. And for a long time, he got away with that. But the problem with Matt is he's collided now with reality and his own character. We talked about this the other night, Tara, when I had Peter Schorsch on. Nobody in Florida was surprised by this. Nobody in Florida had any moment of like, oh, God, that couldn't be Matt Gaetz, not him. No, everyone was like, oh, of course it's Matt. Of course it's what he's doing. But this is representative of the new type of Republican that exists in Washington today. They believe in owning the libs as the first order of business. They believe that being transgressive, going out there, throwing bombs, doing the Fox News hamster wheel as often as they can is the only thing that matters. Well, we're trying to show that those people that are emerging, they still believe in Trumpism. There are a lot of them. They will keep coming. And so it's important for us to keep shining a spotlight on them. And, and there are a lot of people in the MAGA world who think that this is going to fall apart, that the case is fake news. Well, every day that's passed has made it more real. And, what I'm worried about for Matt is this case is going to continue on before the prom, and it's going to really interrupt his social schedule. So anyway.
Oh, my goodness. This is catnip for the creatives at the Lincoln Project. Catnip.
Yes, it is.
Listen to the cackle, the evil laugh of Rick Wilson. Oh, my goodness. Well, you know what? You reap what you sow. And as my grandmother used to say, God don't like ugly. So
no.
That's all I'm going to say about that. Let the justice system do what it does.
Yep.
Let's bring in tonight's guest, Rick.
Let's
talk about this. Let's talk about this. There he is. Julian Zelizer is known as one of the pioneers in the revival of American political history. He's a professor of history and public affairs at Princeton. He's also a CNN political analyst, a contributor to NPR's Here and Now, and co-host of the podcast Politics and Polls. He is the author of 19 books, as I mentioned before, on American politics, the latest of which is Burning Down the House, Newt Gingrich, The Fall of a Speaker, and the Rise of the New Republican Party, which I did read and interviewed Julian about over the summer. It's fascinating. And he has 2 more books on the way. Julian, how do you have time to do anything else? You are a writing machine. Welcome to The Breakdown.
Thanks for having me. I just love doing it. So it's always a pleasure. Thanks, and it's a pleasure to be with both of you.
Thank you. It shows in your work. And if anyone has, if they haven't read your books, I suggest that they go and do it because you actually make history fun and easily digestible, particularly with the way in which you storytell, the way you tell the stories about history. It's fascinating. And in your book, Burning Down the House, you focus on Newt Gingrich. And what attracted me to that book is that was the era in which I came to my political maturation. Mm-hmm. In the early 90s, the Republican Revolution, Newt Gingrich was at the pinnacle of his career. And kind of reliving how he got there and that era was eye-opening for me in a lot of ways, because I look back and I remember those fights. I remember those things that he did. And I think to myself, my God, I didn't realize how damaging those things would be, the tactics that he used would be in the long term. And here we are 25 years later. Let's take a recap. Let's show a recap of some things and set up the conversation. Let's take a look.
Questions about the future of the Republican Party are numerous.
If we idolize one person, we will lose.
We cannot allow this.
Trump wants to establish that he is the future of the party.
I am not starting a new party.
I don't know if he'll run in 2024 or not, but if he does, I'm pretty sure he will win the nomination.
Republicans under Trump have betrayed everything they used to stand for.
Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene, Republican of Georgia.
Have you guys been following 4chan, Q? Many in our government are actively worshiping Satan.
25-year-old Madison Cawthorn winning the North
Carolina race.
He's facing some troubling allegations.
More than 150 people from the college signed onto a letter last year blasting what they said was Cawthorn's predatory behavior.
I can't express my emotions that I'm feeling right now.
What lies ahead for the Republican Party?
Would you consider getting in that race?
John, I'm always up for a good fight.
Rudy Giuliani's son says he is planning to run for governor of New York.
And it will be so.
Former reality TV star Caitlyn Jenner is exploring a run for governor.
Tick-tock on the clock, but the party don't stop.
Enthusiastic Republicans tend to be the most devoted Trump followers.
Republicans in Congress, they better get with him and stand with him or they're going to be out.
Donald Trump knows now what to do. That's what the Lord told me.
Do we have hope that there's a possibility to see Donald Trump run again in 2024?
You do have hope.
God help us. Julian, how did we get here and what role did Newt Gingrich play in all that?
Well, I think what historians have been looking at is the path to the Trump presidency, rather than just looking at it as an aberration, as a one-off, seeing that some of the seeds were planted a long time ago. And Newt Gingrich was one of the key Republican players who promoted a real smash-mouth form of partisanship, where almost anything was permissible, where the guardrails could be taken down, and where he argued Republicans had to do whatever was necessary to win. And I think in the 80s and early 90s, culminating with his speakership, he brought that style of partisanship to the very top of the party. And it's accelerated or deteriorated, depending on your point of view, with successive generations of Gingrich-like Republicans. So I think he created the roadmap in many ways that President Trump followed.
What were some of the highlights or lowlights, I guess, depending on which side of the issue you're on, of some of the things that Gingrich did that we can draw a through line to what we're seeing today, particularly with his use of the media?
Yeah, I think there's several precedents that he set. One was to use not just the conservative media, but actually the mainstream media, even while creating image of the media as a villain. Gingrich actually used it as his platform. He understood that conflict, that sensationalism, that going after your opponents in dramatic, aggressive language was a great way to get on air. He did this by attacking Democrats in 1984 when the chamber was empty in front of C-SPAN cameras, basically accusing them of not supporting the national security of the country. The public couldn't see he was talking to an empty chamber, but it looked as if Democrats had no answer. He also introduced the use of really blistering language. He was very explicit that it was legitimate to say almost anything about your opponent. And he releases a memo in 1990 through GOPAC saying, call Democrats sick, traitorous, language which today seems mild, but at the time was pretty dramatic. So those are two examples of things he put forward.
Yep, that's it's called performative politics, right? Performative politics, Rick.
Julian, you're absolutely right to bring that era of the Conservative Opportunity Society, where Gingrich and a small cadre of folks, including a guy I worked for at one point, Connie Mack, would take to the floor, deliver these incredibly fiery speeches. They back at the NRCC in the day, they would take those things off the camera feed and turn them into video press releases, which, at the time seemed incredibly high tech. And now it would be sort of pro forma, but using that technological moment and using that rhetoric that was way transgressive for the time, it seems like we've just iterated on that over and over again to where we are now in a lot of ways. It's just like it was like rocket fuel now with technology, all the friction's out of the system.
No, he understood what we now call going viral. And the example you're just talking about is almost an early example of that. And Gingrich used to say that that to get on television, the television media wants more Indiana Jones than Philharmonic. And what he meant is you had to just, give them red meat. And that's exactly the kind of clip that would then be repeated over and over. And so it isn't hard to see the connections where we are today with what Gingrich was doing before he was speaker in the 1980s already.
And the thing about Newt Gingrich is that he's actually a masterful orator. He's actually one of the best debaters when you get him in a one-on-one. And so he didn't come across as a complete, whack job or, a fringe person, because he touted himself as a student of history. And he was such a good orator that it kind of, you didn't really realize how much he was manipulating what was actually going on. Unless you were really paying close attention and kind of, knew what to look for. But that was part of his appeal and part of the success of the Republican messaging machine in the 90s. Because I remember that I'm a student of that. That's what I grew up under when, at George Washington University as the vice president of the college Republicans, interning on the Senate side and on the House side at 18, 19, 20 years old. I was surrounded by that, which is what makes me such a good operator now, because I know all the tricks, right? That's what makes the Lincoln Project and Rick and those guys so successful, because we worked for these guys. We know the playbook.
We know the game.
I mean, part of it was Republicans in that era felt that they weren't enmeshed in the major political institutions of the period. That sure, Gingrich weaponized and used network televisions and mainstream papers, but Republicans felt disconnected from it. And they certainly had not been in power in Congress for decades. Democrats controlled the House of Representatives since 1955, effectively since 1933. So I think conservatives were always very sensitive and attuned to how the media could be a weapon, how the media could be the major platform. And so that is in part why they became so good at it. And with Gingrich, you had someone who didn't feel boundaries. And if you don't feel boundaries and you have a media which can get into quick frenzies over this kind of material, it's a pretty combustible combination.
Sure. And he didn't have boundaries not only in politics, in his professional life, but also in his personal life. He, engaged in some rather questionable behavior that raised eyebrows, particularly back then. Nowadays, I guess it's par for the course. But, as someone who claimed to be this conservative and the values voters crowd and all of this, the way he treated his wives was pretty questionable. But, it kind of leads me to what's happening now with this whole cancel culture thing. This kind of started this idea of using the culture war as a political weapon. The Republicans mastered this also during the 90s. And then with the advent of Fox News in 1996, it just gave them, Roger Ailes understood this. He was a mastermind of this even back in the Nixon days, understanding how fear and the culture war arguments were a rallying point for people. And now you see this is what they're doing. Republicans are not serious about legislating. They're not serious about governing. They care about performative politics, which is an expression I got from Chris Krebs when we were on a panel together at UVA, because I told him I was going to use it because it's so accurate. Here's a clip from Dan Crenshaw of Texas as an example. Let's roll it.
The Democrats have successfully captivated the institutions, pop culture, Hollywood, our education institutions, and now our corporations into their own woke agenda. This is fascism, right? And they use cancel culture as a tool to impose their fascism on us.
I mean, it's so boring at this and predictable, but it seems to work for them.
In the 80s and 90s, it was political correctness. Back in the 60s and 70s, it was an attack on the counterculture and some of the arguments even Nixon made. Right. But now it's taken, I think, a whole new level, and it has a platform in the media on places like Fox, which isn't a maverick station, by the way, despite how it's often presented. And so I think it's powerful, and it offers, I think, two things to Republicans. One is the disconnect between a lot of the economic policies you've seen from Republican administration, certainly President Trump's administration, And this appeal to be a populist working class party, it doesn't always mesh together very easily when it comes to economics. So something like cancel culture is easier to talk about. And it's also just a way to point to enemies. I mean, a lot of the rhetoric you hear today from conservatives is about enemies out to get you, whether it's enemies in the media, the fake media, enemies at the university. And cancel culture kind of encompasses everything. And even corporations who have been pretty closely allied to the Republican Party now are being brought into that because of the protests against voting restrictions in Georgia.
Right.
That's right.
You know, I wrote about this in one of my books about, you know, the idea of shifting from a party with a bunch of normative ideas that were about individual liberty or fiscal probity or the Constitution or national security to the owning the libs party, to the media-centric party. There is a certain ugly brilliance to it. They understand very well that their audience they don't have a single thing on their checklist anymore. They don't care about any real issue. Everything is about the aggrievement, is about the anger, is about the you're one of the experts, the smart people, the educated people who are oppressing us. And they hate it. They hate anything that smacks of that. And so it's an easy kind of politics, really. It's kind of, you know, it's kind of
lazy.
We've seen this.
It's lazy politics, Rick.
Right. But it's
right? Because in the
now.
90s, right. Because in the 90s, they had the Contract with America, which was actually a governing document of policies, whether you agreed with them or not. At least they showed, they gave an enumerated example of policies that they would put forth if they were elected and were able to take over Congress and control things. Now, why do people vote for them? It's because they're the grievance mongers. They give them a voice.
National Trumpism. Say what you will about the tenets of national Trumpism. At least it's an ethos. If I may bring my Big Lebowski reference into the game tonight.
Great movie.
Right. I mean, I'd say one other thing. I think what you're saying, look, part of what became very clear and was exposed in the Trump presidency is a fundamental lack of concern with governance right now in the Republican Party. And it became magnified toward the end when here we are in the middle of a pandemic and the administration, it was tragic and comical at the same time, the way they were speaking about the issues, the inattention they were devoting to core problems that were leaving, you know, tens of thousands of people dead, hundreds of thousands of people dead, and our country shut down. And I think it's a little bit of that still today. It's easier to talk about Dr. Seuss books than it is how do we figure out a way to normalize the country again and to contain future pandemics. It's low-hanging fruit, but in the long run, it doesn't really make for a very robust political party. It's not a party of ideas or policies. It's really almost geared around Fox television hits and quick stories that will attract viewers who are angry, but not actually solve the problems the nation faces.
They haven't been interested in solving problems since the Tea Party, since 2010. Just ask John Boehner. You know, what Boehner went through as speaker and what he had to put up with the Tea Party folks was, I think, a prelude for what we see now with a certain amount of unseriousness when it comes to actually governing. You can complain about all of these things, but then, okay, now you're in a position to change things. How are you going to do it? And they were completely uninterested in that. And 10, 11 years later, it's even worse than it was back then. And, you know, we mentioned about the companies and how that's now this whole idea of cancel culture and corporate America being dragged into this. And Mitch McConnell telling CEOs to stay out of politics, and, you know, the Texas AG threatening businesses now in Texas, corporations there, because Texas is the next voter suppression state with the stuff they're trying to pull there. But there's a historical precedent for this, and you've written about it back in the civil rights era, where companies had to pick sides. As Stu Stevens often says, what side of the Edmund Pettus Bridge would you have been on? Is a question that folks need to ask themselves today. Can you elaborate a little bit on that, and particularly about Martin Luther King and Coca-Cola?
Yeah, it was interesting. In the 1960s, though business certainly was not the driving force behind civil rights protests, you did see at different levels business start to come along and throw their support. In cities like Atlanta and Birmingham, you saw a shift in the business community. Sometimes it was practical, not moral, but pushing for integration is the only way really to save the region, as much of the country was changing in what they perceived as legitimate in terms of voting, in terms of racial segregation. And then after Martin Luther King won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964, there was going to be a celebration in Atlanta, an integrated celebration. And many business leaders didn't want to actually be part of that. It was seen as something that wouldn't sit well with many people in the state. And the CEO of Coca-Cola really pressed business leaders to be part of this, to contribute to it, and that the city had to embrace it, even threatening to potentially move if they didn't. I don't know how serious the threat was, but it was certainly part of the conversation. So again, they were not responsible for the civil rights movement. It was activists on the ground who risked their lives. But you did see that sometimes business reaches a point where they say, standing in the way of this kind of progress and legislation is just not tolerable anymore. And I think you're seeing some of that right now at an even grander level, with global corporations really using their leverage to demand change.
You know, I saw something interesting today in the supermarket. They in Giant, which is a major supermarket chain here in the DC area, they actually had tags underneath products that said Asian owned, Asian Indian owned, trying to, because of the atmosphere that we're in now, and with this the idea of before it was Black Lives Matter, now we're in this horrible time where there's this violence against Asian Americans, and I found that to be very interesting because I'd never seen that before. I've never seen them have Black-owned products labeled in the supermarket, which maybe they should, but I just find it using capitalism and free markets to actually this is a very Republican thing, right? Republicans should be all for this because it's letting the consumer decide instead of the government imposing it. And I think that's interesting. Do you think that this is actually going to have an impact? You know what? We actually have the McConnell clip that I mentioned before. Let's listen to McConnell threatening people. Woo.
So my warning, if you will, to corporate America is to stay out of politics. It's not what you're designed for. And don't be intimidated by the left into taking up causes that put you right in the middle of one of America's greatest political debates. So that's my admonition. And Delta and the other Coca-Cola and the other companies that basically responded to this partisan appeal are doing the same thing. You know, Republicans drink Coca-Cola too.
It's so infuriating. It's so infuriating. Don't take a position. You know, this is kind of important. We're talking about voter suppression here, but, don't take a position. Like anyone's listening to Mitch McConnell. Go ahead, Julian.
I mean, look, here's a party leader whose party certainly under his term has been more than happy to take corporate money and has fought campaign finance tooth and nail. That's part of what's going on right now. That's part of that voting bill, which, many people, including the Koch brothers, are against. And so here he's saying this is the moment that it's unacceptable for business to be part of politics. The hypocrisy is a bit hard to listen to. And then he's doubling down. He's threatening businesses who are protesting the fact that there's this legislation that's going to make it more difficult for people to vote. So it's almost as if stay out of politics if you're not on our side. If you're on our side, the door is wide open. But look, Senator McConnell doesn't care. Pointing out inconsistencies, pointing out hypocrisies doesn't bother him. He too is a partisan warrior. And what he cares about is preserving his power and regaining a majority for the Republicans in the Senate. And I think he'll say just about anything to do that.
Clearly, Rick, there was there's a couple polls out recently that have shown us kind of where the Republican Party is and how people, there was a Reuters Ipsos poll that said that something like 55% of Republicans don't believe that Donald Trump was lost fairly. They think that the election was stolen from him. Like 81% still approve of him. This is insane how I don't know. I mean, Max Boot wrote an op-ed today in the Washington Post about like the party's done. It's not salvageable. You know, if you're not a Democrat, but you're a centrist kind of, you know, Republican leaning, you're a Biden Republican. You know, I mean, I think it's an interesting debate because I don't know, that there's a lot of friends of ours that think the Republican Party still has a chance, and you know, you can try to save it from within. But I'm not so sure when we see these numbers after the insurrection. They don't think that Donald Trump was responsible for the insurrection. You know, these people are living in an alternate universe.
You know, I think that's right.
Yes, I think, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead, Julian. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, the kind of argument, there's two arguments. One's a normative argument that the Republican Party has lost its ideas and principles and it's not salvageable. And I think there's a strong argument that many people make about that. But there's another, is the party on the brink of some kind of collapse, implosion? Is it going to shrink dramatically? And I don't know. The verdict is out. I mean, there's still a lot of support or evidence that the party has muscle. The information system that operates in Republican circles that you're talking about is still very effective. You see this in the polls. You saw it in continued support for President Trump within the Republican Party. The margins for Democrats are still narrow in Congress, and it's unclear what's going to happen in 2022. So I'm not convinced, regardless of whether the party's in good shape or not intellectually, that it's on its way out. And I'm not even sure yet, even with groups such as yours and some writers like Max and others, if the peel-off is going to be dramatic enough to either create a new party or to undermine the strength of the Republican Party. I think it's not clear yet in which direction this goes.
I agree. Yeah, Julian, I agree with that. I mean, there's nothing harder in this country than launching a third party, a legitimate, nationally competitive third party. It is a very high mountain to climb. And some of our friends on the center right are trying, I know, and I'm watching what they're doing, and I've been close enough to this sort of thing before to know how difficult it is to get on the ballot in the states and how the duopoly is wired pretty tightly into our structure. What I do think is happening is that exactly. You're completely right, Tara. I do think it's wired so tightly that although the GOP is going to take enormous damage and is dead as an intellectual party, as a movement, as a brand, it will attract enough people to have and given the way the states are engineered with redistricting, it's going to hold on for a while, even though it's going to be reduced in its ability to have a national voice.
I think that's a fair way to look at it. And one of the big questions isn't necessarily if a third party forms, but what can the Democrats, if at all, pick away and create a new coalition like Reagan did with Reagan Democrats. And you see those kinds of shifts where the party structure remains the same, Rick, and then you have movement within the parties. I don't know if that's going to happen. I still am not convinced at this point you're seeing any big bulk of Republicans defect. You have high-level Republicans, but at the ground level, look, Trump ended, still very popular with many Republicans, and the radicalness of his administration can't be forgotten. What he did, including the final month, the climactic insurrection, and yet the polls show support for him, belief in what he said, and that says a lot about the durability of this Republican Party as is, without a great change at this point.
It's depressing and infuriating and alarming. I say it all the time because you're right. This is not a small amount of people who are still supporting this guy. And, they've created something, we refer to it as Trumpism. But this is what's overtaken the Republican Party now. And yet the party is still shrinking. Right. I saw another poll that showed that Democrats have a 9 percentage point advantage over party ID. So the Republicans did lose a decent amount of people to becoming independents like myself. And there are a lot of people like myself and Rick, we feel politically homeless because we don't necessarily agree with everything that the Democrats do policy-wise. Sure. I take some issue with a lot of what they do, which is why I'll never be a Democrat. But at the same time, there's no room for me or Rick or any of us who are conservatives or center right in the Republican Party, we're apostates. Because there's no ideology anymore that is what we were brought up on as Republicans or Republicanism or conservatism. I just don't know what the answer is. There's a lot of ongoing debate about this that I think there's no easy answer to. Maybe it is an insurgency within the Republicans. Historically, that hasn't really been successful since the Whigs, right? Correct me if I'm wrong, history professor.
No, it's right. Tough. But again, parties can change. I mean, I don't think it's going to be easy. Part of my dating this back to Gingrich is to show this is a deep-rooted shift we've seen in the party with a certain radicalization that's taken place in the GOP that's hard to undo. But Gingrich's story goes a different direction. There was a generation that changed the Republican Party. I mean, many believe not for the better, but they did change it. So either you see shifts of people outside a party that change it, or a new generation of leaders perhaps that emerges, younger Republicans, not Tucker Carlson's, but Republicans who are more believing in governance and thinking of issues in a different way, a conservative way, but not the way you hear right now out of mainstream Republican leaders. That's what's going to be needed.
Before we let you go, let's take a tweet. We have a tweet for you. Debating with opposing views seems to have gone to the wayside. Do you think this is by design? Fear, perhaps, by the GOP? Julian, I think this goes to what we said before, that they're no longer a party of ideas. They're just a party of whiners and complainers because it's lazy and easy.
Yeah, look, some of the difficulties of debate go beyond party politics, and it's part of how the country is right now, deeply divided and seeing the world through two fundamentally different prisms. But I do think back on Capitol Hill, one of the parties isn't interested in negotiating right now. They're not interested in a debate. And I think Biden has become aware of that over the years, and that's why he's using reconciliation and acting in an aggressive fashion. But if you have that situation, it's incredibly dysfunctional. Deliberation requires both sides to actually be engaged in discussions about policy, and we don't have that right now.
Indeed, we don't. I look forward to the day when we can have those policy debates. I say it all the time because that's what made me become a conservative and a Republican, was to actually have better governance and, little r republicanism. And we're so far away from that. We're like literally fighting for our democracy every day. It's a heavy lift, but we're here to do it. Julian, before we let you go, I wanted to give you an opportunity to talk a little bit about Holocaust Remembrance Day, because I know that you come from a family of multi-generations of rabbis, and I wanted to give you an opportunity to talk about what Holocaust Remembrance Day means to you and your family.
Well, it's always incredible sadness just thinking of all the lives lost and the kind of hatred that was behind it. It's one of the moments in world history that's just so devastating every time you remember what happened. That on a day like this, I can't get that out of my mind. You see the worst of humanity. And this was one of those moments when it came forward. But for me, the lesson is also to prevent that from happening. The fight for human rights, the fight for social justice is not disconnected from remembering a horrible event like the Holocaust. It's an effort to prevent that from ever happening again. And those are the kinds of thoughts that I think about because of my family, because of my own life as a Jewish American. And my next book is about someone who lost many people in the Holocaust and barely survived himself when he came here to the States. So it's been very much on my mind this year.
Well, that we appreciate that, and we honor all of those who were, not only suffered, but then who also were able to overcome it and who fought against it and continue to. So thank you, Julian, for what you do and to your family.
Thank you, Julian.
And make sure you check out his books. If you're interested in Newt Gingrich and the Republicans, check out his book, Burning Down the House, and his new books that are coming out. And I have a confession. I was actually a trainer for GoPack back when Newt Gingrich had started GoPack. That was one of the things I did. So anyone who ever questions my Republican bona fides, I always just tell them, check the resume, okay? Because it's laughable if you question where I came from. Trust me, I'm nobody's liberal. Anyway, thank you, Julian. Appreciate you.
Thanks, Julian. Appreciate
Thanks
it.
being with both of you. Bye-bye.
Have a great night.
You too.
It's true, Rick.
He's so brilliant.
I mean, he is. And he, like I said, he makes it so digestible. I mean, anyone who can write 19 books about history and then still continue to write more, you can just see how passionate he is about it. And they're easy reads. Not all historians, write that way. Sometimes they're a slog to get through, but not Julian Zelizer books. So glad we had a chance to chat with him.
Very fluent. I love it.
Yeah. Hey, Rick, before we go, I hear one of your former boss's sons wants to run for governor in New York.
Andrew
Giuliani.
Giuliani is going to run for governor of New York, apparently. I can't even begin to tell you. We're going to see a new. So New York State is functionally about 25 to 28% Republican in statewide races. It's a very tough state. 65% of the vote is within about a 50-mile radius of Manhattan. That's a very blue area of the country. Andrew Giuliani is going to if he racks up 100% of the vote upstate, he still gets his ass beat, like in a humiliating knockdown. The Giuliani
Even with
brand
Long Island,
in New York,
right? Even you have that Republican pocket in Long Island, like, where Elise Stefanik and those people, it's not going to matter.
Right. It's still not going to work. And there's a few little upstate pockets and there's a few little reddish areas on Long Island. He's going to get his ass handed to him. He's going to beat like a rented mule. It's going to be unbelievable.
It's, again, this whole idea of these kids running because, off the legacies of their fathers. And in this case, I mean, the Giuliani name is mud now in New York, which is just, again, another fall from grace, from America's mayor to a laughing stock. It's just, it's a shame. And now his son's going to take up the mantle, failing up again, as I said earlier in the show. Jeez. Well, anyway, that's it for tonight's show. Make sure that you guys.
Tara. I'm glad you had a great vacation. So I will see you again on Tuesday.
You will. And we want to make sure that everyone subscribes to our Honestly Abe newsletter. If you haven't, please do. There it is. Get all kinds of good tidbits in there. Clips from the show. You find out some of our ads and what's happening. We have On the Bright Side, which I think is a cool addition because we need to have some happy stories because there's a lot of horrible things happening. So happy stuff is good too. And follow us on Twitter at LPTV if you're not following us there. And we have a snippet from the latest podcast episode, which is really interesting because Michael Cohen is the guest with Reed Whelan, and he's got a lot to say. So check out the podcast with Michael Cohen, and we'll see you on Thursday. And check out We're Speaking tomorrow.
Good night, folks.
Good night.
Donald Trump is a fraud. He's a con man. And that's exactly what he is. And by the way, so is Jared Kushner. So are all of the others that were around him. This was all supposed to Donald Trump is a fraud. He's a con man. And that's exactly what he is. And by the way, so is Jared Kushner. So are all of the others that were around him. This was all supposed to be nothing more than the greatest infomercial in the history of American politics. Nobody expected Trump to win, including Donald Trump.